one all tied together. It's
Right.
the first that I'm reading my husband's last and final book that he wrote.
This situation just stopped being messy and crossed into something significantly more serious and consequential. Because what looked like a smooth and completely uncontested transition of power in the weeks following Charlie Kirk's death has suddenly shifted in a way that changes everything. Who controls the legacy, who profits from the name, and who holds the actual legal authority to speak for what he built? All of that is now actively in question. And at the center of this dramatic shift is a legal move that arrived quietly but landed with enormous and immediate force. Reports are circulating that Charlie Kirk's parents have taken action to legally secure rights connected to his name. And if those reports are accurate, the implications reach into every single corner of everything tied to Charlie Kirk's public identity. The books, the podcasts, the merchandise, the media platforms, the organizational connections to Turning Point USA, and the ongoing revenue streams that a name of that profile continues generating long after the person carrying it is gone. This is not a family disagreement playing out in emotional and personal terms. This is a structural question about ownership, about who holds the legal authority to monetize, license, and control the commercial use of a name that is simultaneously a personal identity and a fully functioning brand worth potentially millions of dollars in ongoing commercial value. And when that kind of authority gets contested, it doesn't just create tension between the people directly involved. It creates real and immediate uncertainty across every project, every product, and every public-facing initiative that has been operating under the assumption that existing control arrangements were stable and completely unchallenged. To understand why this development carries the weight it does, you have to understand the specific commercial ecosystem that Charlie Kirk built across the course of his career. Because this is not simply the legacy of a public figure in the abstract or sentimental sense. This is a fully operational brand infrastructure with multiple active revenue channels, an engaged audience of millions, and institutional connections that generate ongoing financial and organizational value on a significant scale. The books alone represent substantial commercial territory. Charlie's published work sold in significant numbers, and any future publication carrying his name, including the posthumous memoir that has been sitting at the center of major controversy regarding how much of it was actually completed in his own words, generates publisher advances, royalty streams, and subsidiary rights that flow directly to whoever holds the relevant intellectual property and estate rights. The question of who controls those rights is not some peripheral administrative detail buried in legal paperwork. It is a question about who receives the money flowing from those commercial arrangements. The speaking circuit, the podcast content, the digital platform presence, all of these continue generating real value after a person's death.
Do you ever get hate from Charlie's work? How do you handle it? Charlie, do you ever feel guilt, or do you ever deal with guilt when
the name and associated content remains commercially relevant? And Charlie Kirk's name is commercially relevant at a level that very few voices in the conservative political media ecosystem have ever achieved. His audience is real, deeply loyal, and actively engaged, which means any content produced under his name or associated with his brand carries a built-in distribution advantage that publishers, streaming platforms, and event organizers will actively pay to access. That is a genuinely valuable commercial asset, and the question of who controls it has a genuinely significant financial answer. Merchandise connected to his name and image, which generated substantial revenue in the immediate aftermath of his death and which has continued to be sold through Turning Point USA's commercial operation, represents yet another ongoing revenue stream that the question of name rights directly and immediately affects. Who has the legal authority to license the use of his image and name on commercial products? That question has a financial answer, measured in real dollars flowing to whoever holds that authority. And right now, that authority is being contested in a way that nobody who was watching this situation closely a few months ago fully anticipated. The timeline of how the transition of public control actually happened in the days and weeks immediately following Charlie's death is what makes the current legal development so specifically and precisely significant. Because speed matters enormously when establishing operational control over an organizational ecosystem. Erika Kirk moved quickly and very visibly. She was making public appearances within days of his passing. She was managing messaging around his book almost immediately. She was conducting internal organizational meetings according to multiple insider accounts within the first week. She stepped into the CEO role at Turning Point USA within 8 days of his assassination. That speed created a specific and powerful kind of fact on the ground, the fact of established operational presence. When someone is publicly operating as the controlling authority over an institution, over a brand, over a commercial ecosystem, that presence carries both organizational and potentially significant legal implications. It is considerably harder to challenge control that is already being actively exercised than control that is merely claimed on paper without demonstrated presence.
Just dropped. Erika Kirk has removed the wedding photo of her and Charlie Kirk from Charlie's office. What is happening?
And the comprehensiveness of Erika's early positioning across public communications, internal organizational decisions, commercial operations, and public-facing brand management suggests a level of preparation that went well beyond what organic, grief-driven responses typically produce in circumstances like these. Charlie's parents, by stark contrast, remained relatively quiet during that early period. They were not visibly competing for organizational authority. They were not publicly challenging the rapid and comprehensive transition. They were not making statements that positioned them as alternative claimants to his legacy or his organizational direction. And that relative silence was interpreted at the time in various ways, as respect for Erika's grief, as comfort with how things were proceeding, as deference to the organizational structure Charlie had built around himself during his lifetime. But the legal move, if the reports circulating are accurate, fundamentally reframes what that early silence actually represented. Because filing for trademark protection or legal rights over a name is not something that happens overnight in direct response to a sudden and immediate grievance. It requires legal consultation, documentary preparation, and the kind of deliberate and methodical process that takes real time to properly initiate. Which means the parents were apparently not simply absent from this situation in those early weeks. They were quietly doing the foundational groundwork for a formal legal claim while Erika was simultaneously building public operational presence and organizational momentum. Two completely separate processes running in parallel in entirely different domains, both heading inevitably toward a collision that is now actively underway. The specific mechanism of name rights and trademark control is worth explaining clearly, because understanding what a trademark actually does in this specific context is essential to understanding why this development carries the implications it does. When a person's name is used commercially on products, in promotional materials, in organizational branding, that commercial use can be legally protected through trademark registration. Trademark rights establish who holds the legal authority to control and license that commercial use, and they provide meaningful legal recourse against unauthorized use by others.
First, that I'm reading my husband's last and final book that he wrote, and when you finish that, that's the last time.
For a name like Charlie Kirk, attached to books, to merchandise, to a major political organization, to media content distributed across multiple platforms, trademark rights are not symbolic or ceremonial. They are the legal architecture that determines who has the actual authority to say yes or no to any commercial application of that name. If Charlie's parents successfully established trademark rights over his name, they would effectively hold a legal veto over every commercial use of it. Every product, every publication, every licensing agreement, every event promotion that invokes his identity in any commercial context. That kind of legal authority doesn't just shape what happens going forward. It potentially reaches back into what is already in motion. Projects that were initiated, contracts that were signed, commercial arrangements that were already established. All of these could come into genuine question, depending on whether they were properly authorized by the party that legally controls the name. And in a situation where significant commercial activity has been happening under the assumption that existing control arrangements were stable and uncontested, the introduction of a competing legal claim creates real and immediate uncertainty across the entire commercial ecosystem. The book situation sits at the precise intersection of all of these competing interests in a way that makes it the single most commercially significant and most practically contested element of the entire picture. The posthumous book, Stop in the Name of God, was publicly promoted by Erika, positioned as Charlie's final message to his audience, and placed at the center of significant controversy regarding how much of it actually reflects Charlie's completed words versus content that was shaped or completed after his death by others.
Also thought what was interesting is that you said the next morning when he snuck in, he grabbed his wedding band. Again, minor detail, but I asked myself, why was his wedding band?
The book was nearly published, generated significant pre-order activity and real financial commitments from buyers, and was then apparently pulled by the publisher under circumstances that have never been fully or satisfactorily explained publicly. The financial dimension of that situation alone is genuinely significant. Pre-order money that was collected, publisher advances that were presumably paid out, promotional costs that were incurred, all of it existing within a commercial arrangement that the question of legal name control could potentially affect in serious ways. If the party that legally controls Charlie Kirk's name contests the authority under which the book was being promoted and commercially sold, the implications for that entire commercial arrangement become genuinely uncertain and genuinely consequential in ways that go well beyond just one publication. The organizational dimension of this conflict, the specific implications for Turning Point USA, is what elevates this from a personal family dispute into something with much broader institutional significance that the broader conservative political world needs to be paying close attention to. Turning Point USA is not a minor or peripheral operation. It is a major conservative political organization with substantial funding, a large and active staff, an enormous youth-facing platform, and significant ongoing influence over the direction of conservative political culture across America. The name Charlie Kirk is woven into that organization's identity and institutional history at every level and in every context. If legal control over his name is now genuinely contested, if there is real uncertainty about who holds the authority to permit or restrict its organizational use, that uncertainty doesn't just create legal risk for Erika personally. It creates organizational risk for Turning Point itself as an institution. Donors who contribute on the basis of their association with Charlie's name and legacy are giving into an organizational context where the legitimacy of that name's commercial use is now actively contested. Partner organizations and institutions that align themselves with Turning Point on the basis of its Charlie Kirk legacy connection are now navigating an institutional relationship that has this contested legal dimension sitting directly underneath it, whether they fully recognize it yet or not. None of this creates immediate organizational crisis on its own. Institutions of this size and structural complexity have enough momentum to continue operating through significant internal uncertainty without immediately visibly collapsing. But it creates the kind of underlying legal and reputational risk that responsible governance of any serious organization takes very seriously. And it represents a challenge to Erika's positional authority that goes well beyond family disagreement, reaching directly into the domain of institutional legitimacy and organizational accountability in ways that cannot simply be dismissed or waited out. The public perception dimension is running simultaneously alongside the legal dimension, and in the specific environment where this situation is playing out, public perception carries its own form of significant and real power. Charlie Kirk's community was built explicitly around specific values: accountability, transparency, asking hard and uncomfortable questions of powerful institutions, following evidence wherever it leads regardless of social pressure or personal loyalty. Those are the values Charlie modeled publicly and consistently across his entire career. And those are the values his audience genuinely internalized and made central to their own political identity. And now that community is watching a situation unfold in which the widow of their founder appears to be operating with significant commercial and organizational authority, while serious and specific questions are being raised about whether that authority is genuinely legitimate, about the succession process itself, about the financial management of the organization, about the authenticity of specific claims made publicly in Charlie's name, and now about the legal rights underlying the commercial operations being conducted under that name. That specific community, shaped by years of direct instruction to question official narratives and demand real accountability from powerful people and institutions, is not going to quietly accept the official version of events simply because an official version is being confidently presented. They are asking the exact questions that Charlie himself would have demanded they ask. They are examining the evidence that is publicly available and drawing the conclusions that the evidence actually supports, and the fact that a significant and vocal portion of that community appears deeply skeptical of how this legacy transition has been managed represents a form of social authority that the legal process alone cannot fully or permanently resolve. There are two fundamentally different ways to interpret everything that has unfolded in this situation, and both interpretations are being advanced by real people with genuine and sincere reasons for holding them. The interpretation that Erika's supporters advance is that she was the person closest to Charlie, that she understood his vision and his organizational goals more deeply than anyone else possibly could, that the succession was legitimate and properly authorized, and that the family's legal move represents a late and disruptive intervention in a process that was already appropriately established during Charlie's lifetime. From that perspective, the legal challenge isn't protection of a legacy. It's an attempt to claim posthumous control over something that Charlie himself had already arranged and decided. The interpretation that critics advance is fundamentally different in every important respect. That the transition happened too fast, too smoothly, and too comprehensively to represent a genuine organic response to an unexpected and violent death. That the succession was never authorized in any verifiable or transparent way, but was instead imposed through a situation of organizational shock in which institutional resistance was minimal, and the documentation legitimizing the transfer was either absent or unverifiable. From that perspective, the family's legal move is not late disruption of something legitimate. It is a belated and necessary correction, an attempt by Charlie's actual blood relatives to reassert rights that were never properly or legitimately transferred away from them in the first place. Both interpretations are being genuinely and sincerely advanced by people who believe them, and both have specific and concrete evidentiary claims they can point to in support of their position. The unresolvable tension between those competing frameworks is precisely what sustains the extraordinary level of public attention. The situation continues to command week after week, What is certain, regardless of which interpretive framework ultimately proves more accurate, is that this situation is absolutely nowhere near resolved. The legal dimension is actively and consequentially in play. The organizational dimension is navigating genuine and significant uncertainty. The public perception dimension is intensely engaged and watching every development with extraordinary closeness. And the financial dimension, the fundamental question of who benefits from the ongoing commercial value of the Charlie Kirk name and brand, remains genuinely and meaningfully contested in ways that will ultimately be determined by the legal process rather than by whoever successfully established early operational momentum in those first critical days and weeks. This is the middle of a story that has many more chapters ahead of it, not the ending. Every legal filing, every organizational decision, every public statement from any of the parties involved will be closely examined by an audience that has been specifically shaped to take accountability seriously and to refuse easy or convenient answers. And whatever the final outcome ultimately proves to be, whether it involves negotiated shared control, clearly delineated legal authority, settlement between the parties, or fully contested litigation playing out publicly, it will define not just the future direction of Charlie Kirk's legacy, but the relationship between institutional power and genuine accountability in a community that was built from the ground up around the principle that those questions always deserve real, complete, and honest answers. Drop your perspective in the comments right now, because this is exactly the kind of situation where the community's collective understanding genuinely matters. And stay completely locked in, because whatever develops next in this story, we are breaking it down the moment it happens.